Catherine Soto. I'm Catherine Soto Vasquez, and I'm the Associate Director of Programs for SBACT. And I have a few other members here. Rich, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Hi, all. My name is Rich Sander. I'm the Executive Director of SBACT. Glad to have you all here with us. Landon?
I'm Landon Rake, the Operations Manager for SBACT. Pass it to Kayla.
And I'm Kayla Peterson, and I am SBACT's Program Coordinator.
Dropping everything over here. So for today's meeting, I know I sent out the agenda, and we're gonna switch that up a little bit and have Lucille Boss with the County of Santa Barbara open us up. But what we're hoping to is have a discussion around individualized service plans and how to better engage and support individuals as they're transitioning into their homes. So Lucille is going to start off with just some of the COC community action plans, benchmarks, and goals for housing retention. And then I was able to meet with some folks with lived experience and get some feedback on their experience with goal setting. We reviewed some forms, some example forms of individualized service plans, and they were able to give us feedback there on what was working for them and what wasn't. So we'll be reviewing that and then hopefully jumping into a discussion. We have a lot of service providers here that support individuals as they move in. And so really just hearing from everyone what they're seeing, what tools they've used that they're noticing to engage individuals, and any just positive or negative experiences or takeaways that they're experiencing, so that we can kind of talk about that and hopefully work through all those things and come to an alignment in some of these best practices as we're supporting folks transitioning into their homes. So I'll let Lucille do a better introduction herself, but thank you, Lucille, so much for being here today and supporting this conversation.
Sure, thanks for having me. And if the host can give me access to share, I will project a couple screens. Good morning, folks. I think I've met most folks, but there are a couple of names I don't know. My name is Lucille Boss, and I work for the County of Santa Barbara. I'm in a newish role. I'm going to say newish until the end of this calendar year. It's Encampment Response Coordinator, so it's a newly created position by the Board of Supervisors, and I've been in it, I think, since May. So but part of my role that in my previous role with the county that I didn't want to let go was the community action plan implementation. So for folks who don't have the background, each county and continuum of care is required for most federal and state funding to have a local strategic action plan to address homelessness. So you may have been involved in various iterations of that over decades in our community. And our most recent publication was it's called the Phase 2 Community Action Plan to Address Homelessness. And the data analysis and community outreach began in 2019 and then was being published in early 2020, and then everything happened in 2020. So it was approved by the County Board of Supervisors in early 2021. And part of the community action plan is focusing on retention. So we've been fortunate to work closely with SBACT and other organizations and jurisdictions to make sure that we're aligning all of the work that we're doing, because we're all kind of saying the same thing, just in slightly different ways. But I think one of the things I really appreciate about SBACT is how closely you work with the different jurisdictions or cities to make sure that the broad goals are really localized. So today I'll give just a brief overview of the community action plan and then get really into the benchmarks details. So for folks who haven't seen this, this is something that we typically display because I think we always want to have an elevator pitch about how to address homelessness in our community. And in Santa Barbara, we have 3 floors in an elevator, so it needs to be quick. So typically when somebody says, how do we end homelessness? We need shelter, we need housing, and we need services. And I'll specify affordable housing. And if folks are asking, how can we support our system of care now? It's really finding affordable rental units, identifying sites. And I have staff here, but it's really supporting staff retention and staff capacity of our homeless service providers. An overview of the community action plan, and this was from the year 1 report, which came out a few months ago. The overall strategies and priority areas are first to increase access to safe, affordable housing, use best practices to deliver tailored supportive services to meet individual needs. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and discussion that Catherine will be presenting about individual service plans today. Build a collective action plan and improve data sharing. Strengthen support systems available to help residents obtain and maintain housing, and that's what we'll talk about today. And finally, build provider capacity to address the needs of specific populations. In anything and everything that we do, we have these regional system level goals. So it focuses on priority populations, adding new resources, and increasing performance. And I think last month, Kimberly Albers gave a very detailed presentation about system performance measures and all the data that we love to work with on a daily basis. But sort of general terms here are we want to prioritize ending and dramatically reducing homelessness for specific populations. So that may be for families, for veterans, for youth. Second is increasing housing inventory, and that means units and beds dedicated to homelessness and affordability. Third is creating a culture of shelter diversion and prevention across the homeless response system. Fourth is improving overall homeless system performance. And finally, achieving the continuum of care strategies and benchmarks that were approved in 2019. And all of this was drafted in 2019. So it's really exciting to see some of the things that we have done since then. So if I'm thinking about specific populations, we've had 100-day challenges to address youth homelessness, veteran homelessness. We have more funding available to dedicate beds and units to folks who are experiencing homelessness. We have funded shelter diversion, and the emergency rental assistance was, I think, our country's largest investment historically in preventing homelessness. So a lot of this is going on, and it's nice to see that's still relevant. But what I wanted to dive into today was the Continuum of Care program strategies and benchmarks. So this was also approved back in 2019. And I wanted to highlight some of the successes that we've had in each of these just over the past couple of years. So one of the goals was to increase homeless management information system, or HMIS, bed coverages. And really the golden standard is 85%, and we exceeded that, especially through beds that were picked up over the past couple of years. So we're excited to have exceeded that, and we want to make sure that we're maintaining that and maintaining the training and staff capacity that's needed to make sure that we have all the data needed. When it comes to strategies to address individuals and families at risk of becoming homeless, increasing the rate at which individuals and families in emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing exit to permanent housing. You may have been in meetings with us about prevention. So that's something that the Continuum of Care has, I think we're calling them work groups now. We're calling them strategy champions over the past couple of years. We've been focusing on that. Third is rehousing families with children within 30 days of becoming homeless. And one of the best ways that we do that is by having a high-performing system, and by having available beds, by having available units and affordable housing mechanisms. Next is what we'll be talking about most of today: strategies to increase the rate at which individuals and families in permanent housing retain their housing or exit to other permanent housing. So that's really reducing returns to homelessness, so minimizing those returns. Strategies to increase access to employment, volunteerism, and community service. And this is also focusing on promoting partnerships and access to employment opportunities with private employers or employment organizations. Could include training as well. And finally, strategies to increase non-employment cash income. So this is mainstream benefits, but could be other cash income like SSDI or SSI. So that is a lot of information just about the overall strategies. But what we really wanted to talk about today was drilling down into that retention and minimizing returns to homelessness. So I wanted to walk through this slide. So in most presentations, you'll hear us talk about retention. And I think last month, Kimberly presented about why don't we feel like it's getting better? Why doesn't it seem like we're getting better? Because we know we're housing so many people. And we celebrate those successes on a weekly basis with service providers. But we're seeing that outflow from our system, meaning people are exiting homelessness into those permanent housing placements. But why it doesn't feel like we're really moving the needle is because we have so much inflow as well. And they may be folks who are experiencing homelessness for the first time. So that's why we focus on prevention. And it may also be folks who were permanently housed, but something happened and they weren't able to retain their housing. So they've returned to homelessness. So that's why we have both of those lenses, just keeping folks in housing and minimizing returns to homelessness. And I want to distinguish that by saying that if a housing placement isn't working for somebody, rather than an eviction or returning them to homelessness or returning them to shelters, what else can we do to keep that person housed? Can we move them into a different unit, into a different housing model? Are there other supports that they might need to retain their housing, again, in their existing unit or in a different space? So that's that distinction between retaining housing and minimizing returns to homelessness. So I'll walk through a little bit of data on this slide and then kind of tell you how we're addressing the need for retention and ask for where you can plug in too. So the bar chart shows the number of people who retained their permanent housing placement compared to those who were placed in permanent housing. And this is a snapshot of a point in time in HMIS. And this is where we get the high percentage of retention. So between 97 and 98% in 2019 and 2020. And our data improves each year as more partners enter data into HMIS. So for the past 3 years, we've had more coverage and more data entry from housing authority partners, from the VA. And other folks have remained in permanent housing again, or moved to another unit or didn't fall out of their housing. So you can see that data point. Also shows returns to homelessness. And this shows the percentage of people who returned to homelessness, meaning they exited their permanent housing placement over the course of 2 years. For example, of the 724 people who were placed in permanent housing in 2018, 99 people or 14% have returned to homelessness. And I think it's safe to say with this group, we really want to keep people in their housing once they've moved in. We've celebrated that success. We've done the hard work alongside them to get them into housing and to get them the support that they need. And so the benchmarks that are on this slide here show what we're working on and also what we still need to do. So in these efforts, we're really glad to partner with SBACT, which you're leading this working group addressing retentions. And I know partners engaged in this group include housing navigators, case managers, housing authorities, and others who are dedicated to maintaining housing placements. So I'll walk through the points here and just want folks to reflect on how you might be engaged and how we might, how you might be engaged. So first, just evaluating current retention rates and practices and identify barriers to housing stability. So we have that data, and especially with the high percentage of bed coverages in HMIS, we have the data, we have those rates. The practices, I don't know that we have shared in a structured way. So how are we keeping people in their housing? And I think that's something that this group can talk about, but we can also talk about in our regular case conferencing with the coordinated entry system or in coordinated outreach team meetings. And often we will talk through barriers or challenges, but really not in a structured way. But I'd like for us to work collectively to identify barriers to that housing stability. And I think that the ISP that we'll go through today will help with that. expand eviction prevention programs. So again, this was written in 2019. So this is before the world that has ended or that has struggled over the past couple of years. And we have seen the federal and state and local government really make an investment in eviction prevention. But we have seen since moratoriums have lifted that there still have been evictions. So how can we continue to prevent that? Are there other policies that we can put it in place? Third here is developing wraparound services and intensive multidisciplinary in-home case management teams available to quickly intervene when housing stability or retention is threatened. So we've seen investments in multidisciplinary teams with the county's model, for example, when it comes to outreach and ongoing case management, but not necessarily once somebody is placed. So this specifies in-home case management teams. How are partners working together, or are they working together to make sure that somebody has the services that they need to retain their housing or to make connections? And I like to, when I'm presenting to other communities, I like to brag about the Good Neighbor Handbook that that SB Act has created and has shared with providers, because I think that's part of what could build part of an in-home case management team. So it's a resource for folks, but it's a resource for those in-home case management teams to use as well, to make sure that folks, once they're in their housing, are connected to resources. Be helpful to use a risk assessment tools at the front end of social services to be used as part of a prevention strategy. And there are different risk assessment tools, and the ISP is part of that. And that's something when individuals are being placed into housing, into units, that assessment should be part of that placement. Provide training for service providers on specific approaches and best practices that have demonstrated effectiveness in other jurisdictions. And I think we've really focused on street outreach best practices over the past couple of years, but something that we've seen with emergency housing vouchers and the supportive services that were funded alongside them have been that in-home case management team and have also helped highlight those specific approaches and best practices. And I think Alexis either did present to this group or was going to present to this group in the next couple of months, but I think it'll be helpful to hear from her and from our housing authority partners and other service providers to see, what now that we have done this, now that we have this in-home case management team for this specific population, for these voucher holders, what have emerged as best practices in our community and in other communities? What have we learned from others? We need to identify vulnerable people with complex needs and manage those needs. And that's something, again, that the county's multidisciplinary team, which is a partnership between public health, behavioral wellness, and the public defender's office, has helped with more street outreach. But that's something that we do need to see in home case management teams as well. And I think we are seeing that with the supportive services for emergency housing voucher holders. And we need to engage house clients in meaningful activities. So this is, again, where I point to the Good Neighbor Handbook, just an opportunity for folks to get to know their communities, to find employment, to find volunteer opportunities, to get to know their neighbors and get to know their area if they're not familiar with it. So those are all things that keep people in housing. So hopefully you've heard that we've done a few of these things, but we do still need to further develop these benchmarks. And I think that is, so that was from the community action plan. But we also have the state's housing, homeless, and prevention program required us to have an action plan strategy that was more specific over the next couple of years. And they went back a year in our data too. So if you're interested in data, I think Kimberly presented this last time, but I just wanted to note that aside from our community action plan, HHAP and the state said, we want specific numbers and we're going to go back in your data, surprise, by a year. And you have 3 years from a year ago to make these changes in your system. But we're looking forward to especially leveraging different community supports like HIP and CalAIM. So I cannot remember what HIP is. It's Homeless Housing Intervention Program, maybe, but that's through Cal Health and CalAIM, also forgetting that acronym. But those are community supports, especially for folks who are clients through Cal. And that is it for me. I just gave a lot of information, and I think I can show my video. I was worried about not having a capacity on my internet to have video while I was presenting. I just wanted to ask if folks had questions about how, or thoughts about how we can further develop the partnership with the SBACT moving forward in retention. I know
I know,
everybody.
I was gonna say, I know some of that information may have been repetitive from the last meeting, but we always want to keep a lot of that information top of mind as we're having these conversations in this group, since we are collaborating with our COC collaborative applicant, the county, to facilitate these meetings, and just how we can align our objectives and our projects that we end up creating down the line to better align with those benchmarks and goals. And if there's no feedback right now, we can start the second portion and hopefully continue the conversation there. I know
Catherine,
Raina was.
I had a quick comment, and this might be more relevant for the next presentation, but first of all, Lucille, thank you. That was super comprehensive. And it's helpful to just see those benchmarks in writing and to kind of be reminded of them. So thank you for that. One thing that comes to mind kind of came up for us today is just, I think there needs to be maybe more interagency case conferences for clients. I think we do a really good job when we have on-site service providers in permanent supportive housing. We're dealing so often with private landlords and tenant-based subsidy that clients can destabilize in those settings pretty quickly. And one thing that's come up for us is a lot of the residents may start out with one provider, but then that maybe it's rapid rehousing and their time with that provider comes to an end. And there isn't consistently a warm handoff in terms of like an actual transfer of care with actual concrete goals and plans. There's a lot of assumptions like being made about who's doing what. And also, I think a warm handoff should involve the client where they really have a clear understanding of, okay, well, CityNet, for example, may not be able to work with me any longer, but I understand that I can go to Be Well for assistance, rather than clients kind of languishing, not knowing where to turn. And I think you mentioned something about one of your slides said something about just in the realm of eviction prevention, but not waiting until tenancy is being threatened because sometimes it's too late. So
Yeah. I wonder, and I always worry about staff or provider capacity too. But I feel like one of the standards has been after somebody is placed into permanent housing that the case managers are checking in on them, a couple days a week, and maybe that fades to once a week. But there may not be a warm handoff then. And from the data end, we look at like a 6-month look back, meaning, has this person retained their housing? And then we do that at a year, at 18 months, and then at 2 years as well. But you're absolutely right that that's too late if the person has been evicted. So if we see that they've fallen out of their housing. So I think in my dream world, we would have like a regular 2-month look back case conference of like, okay, who's been housed in the past couple of months? How are they doing? Are they needing that weekly check-in anymore? Have you been doing that weekly check-in? If not, who can provide that so they still feel like they have a connection? So that'd be my dream world, but I think that dream world involves everybody having plenty of staff to do that.
yeah.
The skills and resources to connect to also mainstream like social services providers too.
Yeah, I think too often the receiving or the provider that's continuing on has even less capacity than the original provider. So I definitely don't think we're looking at like a twice a week or even every other week situation. And again, a lot of these problems are not difficult to solve. It's just a matter of knowing about them as soon as possible and everyone coming together. So there could be some standard, whether it's rapid rehousing providers or whoever, just clearly stating like, these are the remaining priorities. We'll stay on, you know, until we can be assured that, I don't know, there's a provider out there that can continue to monitor.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's something, if any of the providers on here can say, you know, what they have been doing or what would be helpful aside from having additional staff.
So this is Alexis. Hi, everyone. On another meeting that I've been engaged in, I don't remember what it is, but something that's come up is there's no continuity of care or expectations of providers throughout the continuum. So each service provider operates very differently. And in speaking of warm handoffs, we've done over 200 of them through the EHV program. And they've been very clunky and very different, not just from provider to provider, but even from agency within an agency. So one case manager will provide us a thorough explanation of where the clients are, who their support networks are. We'll meet with the client together. They're willing to show up. Some providers weren't even willing to show up with us and the client to do that warm handoff, which seems so, I think, basic necessity, because we're talking about the client's life. They should be involved in the discussion and their case plan. So I really believe that the continuum of care should put some standards in place. We have written standards in regards to rapid rehousing. We have written standards in regards to shelter. There are no written standards in regards to housing retention that I'm aware of. And I really think that this is something that really needs to be looked at, because we're missing the mark big time, and each warm handoff looks very different. And in addition, there's not even like a basic requirement that there's like service plans or goals or anything. Like, we received a client once who like was on the verge of hospice, already connected to SenCal, all these things, and we like had to dig all that up on our own. Like, none of that was like given to us, where it should have just been like, hey, this is what's going on with this client. This is who their support is. This is why they're connected to, Cottage. This is, so I think like having a written standard of care and expectation for providers who are receiving funding throughout the continuum, who would be in a situation where they would provide a warm handoff to another provider, are really important.
Yeah, thank you, Alexis. I mean, that's 100% true, and kind of why we're also hoping to have these discussions during this retention working group, so we can really come together. And how do we bridge those gaps, right? How do we make sure that even though different organizations might be supporting different clients, that at the end of the day, we're having some of those best practices aligned as much as possible, so then those transitions are as easy as possible. So thank you for bringing that up, and that's definitely something that we can continue to try to plan offline and then continue throughout these meetings that we're having.
Another suggestion that I don't think would be hard to implement is to require service providers to upload service plans in HMIS, so that anyone who would work with them next would be familiar with where they're at and what they're working on. I feel like many times clients, not even necessarily just housed clients, but even the unsheltered or those in shelter, like those unhoused, would go from provider to provider, and it's like starting from scratch every time they meet a new provider for the first time. And I think getting a little bit of insight through them within the system would really be helpful for us to have a better, smooth service to the client.
Which leads us perfectly to the individualized service plans that we're hoping to discuss. And SBAC was able to meet with some folks with lived experience to review that process and just get feedback. And I think a lot of it are what we're talking about right now, that they're feeling on their end of how to be better supported. So I think we can go ahead and jump into that little presentation and then continue the conversation afterwards. It's a short one. So we'll definitely continue. I know this was just some of the key takeaways from the previous meeting that we had last month, where Kimberly was presenting a lot of the data, was really looking to have the 50% of those exiting to permanent housing continue and remain with case management services for at least 6 months. And then 80% of those individuals that are placed to have an ISP, individualized service plan, at the time that they enter housing. Next slide. And so when we sat down with some folks with lived experience that were housed to review ISPs, it was kind of interesting too, because they were just like, what is that? And it's like, oh, it's when you are setting goals to help you with your transition as you move in. So I think we wanted to start there with kind of what is an ISP. And so it's a comprehensive assessment and treatment plan that will follow a framework for identifying and organizing an individual's strengths, needs, interests, and goals. And that plan should cover an individual's life domains. So housing needs, health, employment, family, social network, and addiction, with the ultimate goal to create that network of supportive services for which a client needs to become, I know we hate saying it sometimes, but self-sufficient, independent, to maintain their housing. So I think they really appreciated that definition, and specifically how it covered life domains. Next slide, please. And so one thing, because the ISP is a tool that case management are using, and it's a form, I think the way that it is formatted is important because it's guiding the conversation. And so I presented a couple of templates to the group. One, you'll see them there. One of them is actually from our CES system. It's an official document that providers are supposed to use when they're applying for flexible funding for their clients. And then others were just some examples from the internet as well. And so some feedback there. Well, first of all, I just want to say that they were really excited to participate in this conversation. They were really happy that we were focusing on this need and how to better support people as they're transitioning into their new homes. So they were just really grateful. And what they liked about the formatting for some of the forms was color blocking, of just really kind of clear crystal outline of each section of what that section is going to entail, making sure that there's specific sections that are covering those life domains, and then having those follow-up section, like what are those steps, who's going to be doing what, because one thing that they were talking about was when a form is too vague and if it doesn't have kind of very crystal clear sections or more specific sections and examples, that vagueness kind of leads to them just being like, I don't really have any goals, right? Versus when you break it down and kind of explain the process and the steps and what areas matter, they're more receptive to that and thinking how that applies to their life. Although though it's a fine line, because they were saying as folks are transitioning to their new home, a lot of information can be overwhelming. So it's that balance between how much information or how much, when we're setting goals, like how many goals are we setting that are going to be relevant to their immediate need versus just overwhelming them with information and work and, this is something that we have to create and kind of those high expectations. So definitely a fine line to walk between overwhelming folks who might be in their home for their first time in a very, very long time, but still giving them nice kind of crystal clear outline of what to expect. So then just some comments and suggestions where using layman terms, like, right, when I first introduced ISP, Individualized Service Plan, some of them were just like, wait, what is that? So as we're creating forms, making sure that some of those categories, those headers are more easy to understand for the population, for the individuals that we're supporting. And then just generally, for folks that have been on the street for a very long time, how do you create a goal? Like, what is a goal that is applicable to them and their needs? So making sure that there are options and examples of goals so then they can kind of better understand that as they're creating them specific to them, to themselves. Next slide. And then here's some comments and suggestions just in the conversation that was had. So overall, they wanted assistance with life skill building. As we know as providers, when folks are transitioning from living on the street to a new home, that comes with a learning curve of just navigating some of the basic necessities that they're not used to in their new home because they haven't been in that situation in a very, very long time. Building healthy networks. Sometimes when you're on the street, folks are engaging in behaviors and surrounded by people that aren't going to be the best. And so as they're in a new home and kind of transitioning and trying to make their life better, that means needing new and better support systems and healthy behaviors that they can participate in. So they can continue with growth. An example was, creating a calendar for appointments. Again, not to want to overwhelm someone if they have a lot of medical needs or are taking classes or something like that. Navigating that world of maintaining those appointments can be challenging. So having support with creating that calendar and tracking those things, or even helping if someone doesn't have a lot of appointments or isn't participating in a class, like just some activities to schedule out for the week that they can do, even if it's like, hey, maybe go to the park or, go on a walk or maybe go to the movie theater, something like that. So they have something to look forward to and as time is going on. And just navigating community resources. So I think Shannon with Path, she's brought it up that in the past, or part of their helping individuals transition is just really helping them acclimate to their neighborhood. What is in their neighborhood? Is there a store that they can go to? What is the bus route within that region? And just, a lot of our folks have limited income, so then they might be tapping into a lot of other social services, like Catholic Charities was one, making sure that they know those resources are available, but then how to get there. Is there an application that they need? And so they mentioned just kind of a lot of hand holding. I know that's in the how to increase participation was just, it's going to be a tricky transition. So really hand holding and walking folks through processes for the first couple of times. So if that means going to the grocery store, maybe going with them the first couple of times so that they can really have a comfortable sense of what it means to navigate that service or, that location. So then if something comes up, they know what to do, and not just kind of the general, there's a store a couple of blocks down the street, if you need it, go, and kind of just have that expectation on them to navigate it by themselves. So how to increase participation? They were really wanting to, obviously now folks are housed, it's their home, and they want a more neutral environment, created a more supportive and loving environment. Sometimes, because we're in the world of case management and offering services, things can be technical. Even a name tag, they said, can just be intimidating and it feels very official, and they just want someone to be there as a support. And really, I think the biggest thing, the feedback was just get to know the person first. Like sometimes we jump into the goals right away because, right, we know that that's a need. But if you know the person first and know their interest and skills, I think it helps guide the conversation. And that's really what they were asking for, is just get to know me first before we just jump in and are overwhelmed with kind of this to-do list. And just verbal affirmations, you know, celebrate those milestones. Sometimes I've seen folks don't know how to use a microwave. Once they learn how to use a microwave, that's huge. You can, you know, acknowledge that, celebrate it. They talked about incentives potentially as they're hitting milestones, as they're consistently accomplishing those goals. Like, how can we celebrate that and acknowledge that with them so they have more buy-in, or they feel like this is working and want to continue to participate. Next slide. I want to be mindful of time so we can continue the discussion. But another thing that came up was kind of phasing. I know typically individual service plans are 30, 90 or 30, 60, 90 increments. So they were really appreciative of that. And so one way to, I think, maybe improve that versus, again, kind of going back to that vagueness, is breaking it up into phases. And so that first phase could be really focusing on someone's what they need to live independently. So what do they need to sustain, like physically in their unit? Like, does this person can cook? If they can't cook, how are they going to have resources for food or get food? Things like that. Same with if it's bathing, if it's cleaning, are they able to navigate those kind of daily activities of daily living on their own? And if not, what are those resources that we can connect them to better acclimate? Even just paying the rent, right? I think that's one thing too that we have to help navigate. And then the second phase, going into the more personal kind of extracurricular activities, if you will, for creating a better well-being. So reconnection with family, if there's classes that they're interested in, right? Or, you know, we're talking about sobriety and mental health needs, engaging them there. I think having those distinctions and prioritizing some of those physical needs that someone has when they're moving in can create for a better environment for that transition to be a lot smoother. And so that was just something that they kind of agreed, that they really liked the idea of phases and really focusing on those more basic needs first. And then jumping into some of those other kind of more extracurricular activities. So that was all of the feedback. And again, they were just really appreciative of the fact that we were having the conversation and bringing them in to talk about how to better support and what they were needing when it came to setting these goals. Because that's something that we know all of us as providers are having to do. So now I kind of just want to open up the floor for the last 15 minutes of, you know, feedback on the feedback that we received. And just kind of as providers, you know, does any of this resonate? Again, I know, like Shannon at Path, you've talked about the need to really take clients and acclimate within their neighborhood and kind of what that allows them to do. And if there are any other tips and tricks like that, or just, again, whatever resonated with you all.
Well, I'll go. The way that I've always approached it is really the way you or I would, you know, acclimate to our neighborhood. If I moved into a neighborhood, that's the first thing I would do. I would be going around wanting to know where the stores are, what kind of restaurants were there, what kind of activities there are to do. And our people necessarily wouldn't have the skills to do that. So that I would literally take them, you know, here's the store, here's the gas station, here's a, you know, and then from there, base it on their interests. You know, do they want to go to a gym? Do they like, then is there a gym, library? You know, keep it based on things that they want to do. And then another thing I would do is because this is what I would do, is I would go introduce myself to my neighbors. And the neighbors, for a lot of our PSH people, really stepped up and helped people. They adopted them, you know, like I would, like in the first couple months, you know, we would have to go, you know, every day and then a couple times a week. And then it would go down to, you know, once a week or once a month. And then eventually I would go to visit someone. And I was so happy when there would be a knock on the door and the individual would open the door and it was their neighbor just saying, oh, well, I'm going to the store. Do you need anything? And that's really the way to integrate people into the communities. Same way you know, you and I would do it. I mean, I'm not a party thrower. I'm a party goer, but I love to go. But they could, you know, at some point want to have like a housewarming party, you know, come on over, you know, I just invite the neighbors, have pizza, something simple. I mean, a lot of people do that when they first move to a neighborhood or they buy a new home. They eventually have a housewarming party and invite their neighbors to get to know everyone. And that's something they might want to do further down the line. And that would be a good way too, to keep some of the goals person-centered. I mean, really, who wants to learn how to do dishes? I never wanted to learn how to do dishes, but they might want to have a party. They might want to cook dinner for a significant other. If you could connect it to something that they're really interested in, then yeah, maybe they'll want to learn how to cook, or maybe they'll want to learn how to do dishes if it's connected to something like that.
One thing I was thinking is, you know, the recommendation to make the language more accessible. You know, one of my first thoughts was that, you know, in a lot of ways, these forms are for the providers, but I think making the language more accessible, we should be doing that, you know, for the providers also. They're, you know, a lot of times communicating that same language to the clients, so that, you know, is a good reminder. And then, you know, making the form colorful. And I remember you mentioning making it maybe a fillable, easy to use, you know, kind of form. So just what are your thoughts on kind of the next steps once you maybe get more feedback on how to actually develop the form?
Mhm. Well, I think because some of that feedback was examples of goals and just really walking through what that process looks like, that could be right, because we don't want the ISP to be like 10 pages long either. So maybe it's something that can go tandem with the good neighbor policy, or good neighbor handbook. And then that could be a new addition where we're putting in there kind of what do goals look like, how to accomplish those goals in easy, manageable steps. And then I think, you know, we can just even start with that ISP and those basic, simple changes of the formatting, of color blocking, putting in those sections that cover the life domains, just as an easy start, and then kind of go from there.
I would recommend perhaps maybe getting like pool of what the current providers are using. So I know you pulled from the internet and you pulled from what is on the coordinate entry site or whatever the website, but you might find that the providers already are using something that is meeting these needs. So instead of recreating the wheel, maybe dive into what current providers are using and how that's working for them, and kind of using that as well.
That's a great idea. Yeah. I mean, definitely, if there's a template out there that we're getting really good feedback that works, I think we can go from there. And so I think then the ask would be if you all are willing to share your templates. And we can do that in a meeting too, or kind of just offline of collecting them and then kind of reviewing them and kind of pulling from each one of the strengths, maybe. I don't know how you feel about that.
One thing I just wanted to just mention, kind of like what you're saying, Catherine, about having like easy steps, you know, really outlined and identified simple like goals. One of the forms that we use for our supportive service for veteran families program is we have, it's basically like an ISP, but we call it a housing stability and case management plan. And basically what it is, it lists 3 goals. Both we try to make them short-term and long-term, that are attainable, and we revisit them roughly every 90 days, or as they're being completed, we'll create new ones. So that way, the client's not staying stagnant, and, always trying to work towards whatever it is that they want to work towards. So it's, their goals that they choose with with some of our input. And basically it's like the way it's laid out is it says like person responsible, we'll usually put like, either the client or the case manager, or even both, planned completion date, and then what are the action steps to reach that goal. And it's really like literally outlining them step by step. And it could be as simple as, ensuring that, the client answers the phone when, or returns phone calls when, a certain provider calls for that specific goal or something like that. And again, we just outline what the goal is, and then who's responsible, and then the action steps to get there. And, it's basically a living document in that we, revisit it, review it together, and then create new goals. And even if some that were listed in the previous plan weren't attainable, adjusting, because maybe the focus, readjusted on what it is that they need for either housing or, housing stability. So, but I think like, yeah, outlining each action step and how to get there, and remembering that like, while it might be, easy for us to figure out how to get there, the client that we're working with might not always know what the action steps are to get to that goal, because of, the learning curve and not having been in housing for a while. So they might not have any idea of even how to, obtain that goal without our help. So.
Yeah.
So we actually use our service plans as a living document. So we never do it all at one time. So kind of like Victor was saying, like there's baby goals that make up the bigger goals. And we do it in sections like you had colored off too. So there's like health and wellness, housing stability, financial stability. And so then there's a lot of micro goals. So it's always a living document. I think something too that might be of benefit for like you guys to put together, instead of like trying to figure out a form that everyone's like willing to adapt, is to just create like a fact sheet of best practices in utilizing ISPs for all the providers to kind of adopt. So for example, like I teach on like what I think is a best practice is every time there's an edit to it, the client's given a copy. The client's always empowered to walk out of their meeting. They always have that service plan. When we do our like client advisory committee, we're always asking our clients, do you have a copy of your service plan? Do you know what your service plan is? And that's something that within our agency, we want all of our clients to always know and have their service plan. And so that's like a best practice. I think, well, I've decided it's best practice just because it's logical, right? I don't think there's research on it, but I think I don't know if there's research on it, but I think that would be something that would be really helpful, perhaps because everyone is using some form of a service plan to kind of, once you figure out what everyone's using, but also just have like a best practice guide for providers to use, to know like, hey, it's also best practice that you're providing it to the next person who's working with them. Make sure that they have a copy. Make sure that you're not handing it to the client to fill out themselves, is something that I teach my staff. Like, you never just hand it off and say, I need this for your file, right? So I think that would really be a good idea. Something I also wanted to touch on is we do 2 plans. We do when somebody's housed, we do the individualized service plan, but then we also have housing stabilization plans, which is where whenever there's a threat to someone's housing. So the ISPs are very client-centered, client-driven, whatever goals they want to work on. Sometimes they want to work on losing 5 pounds this week. Okay, great. Sometimes they want to learn to make a salad or make spaghetti, whatever it is, that's their goal. That's their thing. But sometimes there's an issue that's pressing that comes that we have to address. So that's where we use the housing stabilization plan, where we identify the threat to the housing, whether it's unpaid rent, whether it's a noise complaint from the neighbor, whatever that might be. And then we sit with them and do a different goal breakdown of how we're going to stabilize based on this threat. So happy to share both of those documents that we use with you guys. But I think what would be really, as a service provider, really helpful is just kind of like some, like a best practice like list of, this is what ISP's purpose is, this is how you should use it, just for thought.
I just want to piggyback on that really quick. I think that in, you know, what Alexis was explaining is also ensuring that like staff are trained, streamlined or straight across the board. So in that way, like there's no gaps in, you know, certain case managers providing really good ISPs and then some not doing, some that are like super vague, like we've been talking about. That's something that I've noticed over the last couple of years, is ensuring that the case managers are trained on how to properly provide a housing and case management plan. So then that way, like they're you know, actually going to be completing these goals and they're actually going to be effective, opposed to like, you know, find permanent housing, you know, whatever it is, super basic and vague, increase income, like, but how and, you know, what are the steps going to be to get there? So like, again, just training staff to, you know, that way everybody's the same across the board, because that sometimes can be a gap when providing services, when staff aren't trained the same as other staff. And yeah, it's just experience that I've noticed.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alexis and Victor. It's a really great feedback, and I like the direction this is going into. I can kind of see, you know, we have the Good Neighbor handbook for the clients, and maybe we can have like the staffing edition of those best practices, and kind of just like training tools in that pamphlet for staff. So I think that's a great idea. And that's something that we can definitely begin to develop in between these calls, and then share with you all the drafts, and that way you can give feedback and kind of help grow and build that document. So I really appreciate all of that feedback. Emily, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think in addition to creating, you know, the form, one thing I'm hearing from people too is updates to policies and procedures and written standards. So, you know, looking at where those can also be updated. But then, you know, that training piece, I think, is also the key. And in spaces, maybe even for different providers to share what they're doing that works, I think could be useful also.
And maybe too, because I know internally providers have a lot of trainings that take place, but maybe, you know, that could be a part of the CES case conferencing, of having that broader training with everyone present once those tools are developed. I think that's something that would be good down the line.
Yeah, and you know, I think if an agency is really, like you said, you know, if the tool is working well for them, you know, sharing that with other people, you know, what their process looks like.
Well, we're 1 minute over, and so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. And thank you again, Lucille, for presenting and starting this discussion for us, and then just ultimately everyone for being here. I think we had a really good conversation. I appreciated it. I think we're moving in a good direction, and kind of what we have, or what our next steps are. So I look forward to continuing that. And I know, just for the sake of time, we had some general updates in terms of the shelter survey that was just completed. So if Kayla, if you want to just mention really quick that timeline.
Yeah, absolutely. To save time, just really briefly, we've finished collecting responses for the shelter survey and are now in that process of culling the data for any duplicate surveys, going through and adjusting for any sort of contradictory answers inside of those surveys. And then what we'll be doing next is sort of pulling on some of the key threads and putting together a report with graphs and also quantitative and qualitative data. So we'll be looking to share that in the next couple of weeks, but we want to make sure that that data is culled and cared for. And we received nearly 200 surveys. So I think it's a good snapshot of folks both in shelter in the city of Santa Barbara, as well as those who are not currently in shelter. So we're hoping it will provide a good kind of snapshot at this point in time. that will be able to contribute to future conversations around shelter.
All right. Well, thank you. We're 3 minutes over, so I appreciate you hanging around. And again, just thank you everyone for this conversation and being here today. And we look forward to the next one. Have a good day and the rest of your week. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.